Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday the 8th of August. I had to double check then. I couldn't remember what date we were. It is Saturday the 8th of August 2026. It is 9 a.m. This is Teachers Talk Radio, which means this is Saturday Breakfast with me, your host, Darren Lester. How are you? How are we doing? I hope you've all had a good week. I have had a busy week this week. I've had 2 whole things that I've had to do. It has been a whirlwind, let me tell you. One of the interesting things about kind of working from home, as I do, teaching from home, teaching online, is that you don't kind of, or I haven't really noticed what a bit of a shut-in I have become. Not that I mind. I love being at home. I absolutely love being at home. It's one of the reasons that I pivoted when the option came along to online teaching, because it's nice to, not have that commute. It's nice to have all of my books immediately to hand, because in my last school, I did have my own classroom, but it was so small, because it was designed for kind of one-on-one, one-on-two teaching, that when I had bigger classes, I had to use other people's. So all of my stuff would be in my room. And if I had forgotten something, or if a student asked a question and I had a book on it, I couldn't then just leave the class to go and grab it from my room. Whereas, now all of my books are on my shelf. And so if I suddenly spontaneously need one, I can just go and grab it. So, I love having that option, having that flexibility. And I do just love being at home. I am absolutely a homebody. Um, but yeah, you don't kind of realize, or I didn't realize how long it had realistically been. Probably since I had left the town that I'm in. I do leave the house occasionally. I'll go to the library. Um, I'll go to the supermarket. But yeah, so this week, having 2 jaunts out, one up to a village a couple of hours from where I live, and then another over in Leicester to have a meeting with some colleagues, was, yeah, quite intense. Quite intense. And it was one of those things where, I had a great time while I was out both days. It was lovely to catch up with the people that I met with. Had some really great conversations with people. We made some real headway with the work that we were doing. It was brilliant. But Wednesday, so my first day that I was out was Tuesday, and Wednesday I suffered for it. My my introvert batteries absolutely needed to be recharged on Wednesday, and bless them, my poor family suffered for it as well, because I was not in a very good mood. I'm much better. I was much better yesterday, after my day out on Thursday, but perhaps that was because I'd already sort of had Tuesday as that trial run. I don't know, but yeah, it is quite interesting. So my it's not exactly a warning, but maybe something to be aware of for anybody who is maybe starting to teach online this September. Maybe you are thinking that you are ready to transition out of a school and you want to go and teach online yourself. Just be aware of how easy it is for the days to kind of slip by before you realize that you actually haven't been out and been around other people, and then the knock-on effect that it can eventually have when you are out with other people. Yeah, just something to be a little bit mindful of. But I did have 2 very great days. So just in case anybody that I have spent Tuesday or Thursday is listening right now, please don't think that I'm complaining because I had great times. It's just I've told this story on the show before, but in my I want to say it was my second year of teaching, I got told off by the teacher who had been my placement mentor. Because I think, like most people, I got a job in what had been my final placement school, and she told me that I was too reflective. I got told off for being too reflective, um, which I disagree with as a sentiment, but I understand where she was coming from because when she sort of encountered me, I wasn't actually reflecting. I was um, ruminating, and those are two very different. Oh, maybe there's an idea for a show because those are two very different things. Um, but I have always been a reflective person. So just whilst I'm reflecting on what has happened this week, on how my week has gone, I just thought I would give that little warning out there. So, yeah, I hope that you have all had an equally good week. I hope that if you are on holiday at the moment, you are enjoying it. You are taking the time to relax, to recharge, whatever that is going to look like for you. I know, again, I did a show possibly in my first year here on TTR. It was a long time ago now, where we talked about what self care can look like. And I pointed out that sometimes self care does look like doing the work. It does look like sitting down during the holidays and getting your batch of marking done, or getting your schemes of work written, or making your PowerPoints, or whatever it might be. Because for some people, that's beneficial in reducing that cognitive load when you go back, in reducing that to do list when you go back, and just kind of helping um, to transition back into the swing of school. So I think that's my other piece of advice, is figure out what works for you, because I think everybody in teaching eventually figures out what works for them. And I think it's very easy for us to turn around and to tell new teachers, new colleagues, trainees, oh, this is what you should be doing, as if it's the one fit for everybody. And I find it quite frustrating sometimes, and especially because in teaching we can kind of laud other people for doing what we don't do. So, I know that there is quite often a big push, particularly as we talk about work-life balance, where the teachers who like to say, oh, I don't work during the holidays, I don't take work home with me, they will very much push that as the thing that we should all be doing, in the same way that the teachers who do take work home with them and who do work through the holidays might push that as something that you ought to be doing. And the fact of the matter is, both ways work. Both ways are equally valid. So long as the work gets done, it doesn't really matter where and when. So long as you've got something to teach when you turn up to teach your class, and it's in line with your planning, and you know that because you've done the planning, it doesn't matter when that planning happened. So, whatever your self care might look like this holiday, whether it is completely switching off, although if you were completely switched off from teaching, I'm not sure why you would be having breakfast with me this morning. I'm just saying, if you have now only just realized that, and you are thinking, oh, I'm not supposed to be working um, this holiday, but I've tuned into Darren, please don't now go away, stay. We don't mind a little bit of hypocrisy for an hour and a half on a Saturday morning. Um, but yeah, whatever your preferred way of spending the holiday is, I hope that you have been able to do that. I hope that you have enjoyed it. And I hope that I don't want to think about going back to school already. I don't want to think about September being just around the corner. And I used to hate it when people would say that to me, when people would ask, oh, how long have you got left? When do you go back to school? When you would start seeing the back to school sales happening in the supermarkets and the stationery shops and stuff before the year had even finished. So I am going to stop doing that now, to all of you. I'm just going to say, whatever you are getting up to this holiday, however you are spending it, I hope that you are doing it in the way that brings you the most joy, the most relaxation, and the opportunity to be the best version of yourself that you can be when we do eventually go back.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week says a new similar schools model to be used by Ofsted from September won't consider a setting's geographical location, leading to concern it won't adequately consider context. Ofsted has said the model will help strengthen how a school's context is taken into account by inspectors, allowing them to examine performance both compared to national benchmarks and to other schools in a similar context. The data will also be available to schools to identify areas for improvement and connect with others. Experts say there are major oversights with the plan, including a lack of consideration of a school's location and the omission of data on pupil ethnicity. Full details on how the proposed model will work can be found online, as well as comment from education leaders. The BBC covers comments from newly appointed Education Secretary Lucy Powell, who says that making sure the student loan system is fair is at the top of her in tray. She says she stands by comments she made in February when she called interest rates for graduates with Plan 2 loans egregious. She said she was committed to looking at the issue, although acknowledged she can't make any promises about changes. Plan 2 loans were taken out by students in England between September 2012 and July 2023, and they are still issued in Wales. Graduates pay back what they earn above the repayment threshold at a rate of 9%. In November last year, then Chancellor Rachel Reeves said the repayment threshold would be frozen at £29,385 instead of rising with inflation, resulting in earlier repayments for many. More details can be found on the BBC News website. BBC Channel Islands says Guernsey will be providing 2 teachers and a part-time head teacher for Sark's only school from September. It follows the departure of the former head teacher, who was suspended after an investigation in March and later had employment terminated. The Guernsey Education Committee agreed to provide the staff with Sark covering the costs. The school, which caters for pupils aged 3 to 13, is the only one on the island. A spokesperson for the Education Committee in Guernsey said it wanted to ensure pupils across the bailiwick had the best possible education. Finally, The Guardian says that swimming classes have started again in Gaza after 3 years of war. Hundreds of children are learning to float, doggy paddle and take their first strokes in 5 makeshift sea pools built from sandbags and rubble. Amjad Tantesh, who founded Gaza's first swimming academy more than 2 decades ago, has mobilised dozens of volunteers this summer to create the string of pools on the beaches of central Gaza, with tarpaulins providing some shade from the fierce Mediterranean sun. In the morning, they hold free classes for children whose parents were killed in the Israeli attacks. There has been no formal schooling for 3 years, and almost all school buildings have been destroyed. So the swimming classes bring some relief. Full details can be found online. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Thank you, Joe. Very interesting, as always. I do appreciate hearing Joe's roundup of the news from the week. I just want to be very clear before we get into the bulk of today's show. I was not besmirching the back to school stationery offers. Okay, we are living for back to school stationery. It is one of my favorite times of the year when you can start seeing the new planners. Especially, I do like a crisp new planner. So yeah, to be very clear, we were not bad mouthing that. It was just the way that it's framed, the back to schoolness of it, as opposed to the let's buy some shiny new pens. If, as we're talking today, you would like to get in touch, as Tim has done now, there are a couple of ways that you can do so. If you are listening live on YouTube or on X, then you can just drop me a comment. It will appear on my screen. I can then pop it up on your screen and we can interact that way. If you are listening live elsewhere or you are listening to me on playback, you can get in touch with me over on Blue Sky. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MRDLESTER, all one word over there. And we can engage that way because, like I always say, although I haven't for the past couple of weeks, I'm aware, but like I usually say, the topics that I choose to talk about are ones that I am always interested in, that I will always be interested in, I think. And so, it doesn't matter when you are listening to this show, have a chat with me about them because we do like to chat, we do like to engage. So, on that note, our topic today is, do we belong here? Now, last week, we talked about the brat aesthetic, and I kind of used that as a way of considering how aesthetic, how tribalism might impact behavior. And, I talked a little bit about how the whole show was inspired by a documentary about a specific influencer. And, in her late 20s, I believe. But when I was seeing the excerpts from these videos that occurred in this documentary, it reminded me very much of the behavior of the year 8, year 9 girls, what they were exhibiting the last time I was in a brick and mortar school. And so, we spent last week's show talking about how particular aesthetics, particular tribes, particular groups that our young people find themselves in can absolutely or might go some way towards influencing how they behave in the classroom. And I think it's very easy, and I found this when I was doing my research for last week's show. I think it's very easy for us to belittle or demonize or dismiss how important that sense of tribalism, of belonging, of finding your group is to our young people. And I actually think that's one of the more dangerous things that we can do as adults, whether we are classroom teachers or pastoral leads or form tutors, or however we might be interacting with young people, even with your parental head on, or your uncle auntie head, or whatever it might be. One of the worst things that we can do is dismiss how important this feeling of belonging is to our young people, because I think it goes a long way towards explaining why they do a lot of what they do. So that's what we're going to kind of explore over the next hour or so. I'm basing today's show around a study that came out of Eastern Ontario over in Canada that was published in the journal called International Education Studies, in which the researchers Marie Drolet and Isabelle Arcan sat down with 12 and 13-year-olds without their teachers, without their youth workers. It was just interviews between researcher and child, and they posed a very simple question: who matters to you, and why do they matter? It is a very small study. It hasn't, in my reading at least, gained massive traction, but I think it's a really important study because it's very rare that we actually center pupil voice in conversations about pupil belonging, about pupil aesthetics, about what interests them. We quite often look at this through an adult lens. We quite often forget that we did the same thing back in the day, or we assume that we did it differently. And we tend not to ask the young people themselves why they are involved in specific subcultures, what it is about the subcultures that appeals to them, all of the things that would actually get us some answers to these questions, as opposed to us as the adults kind of just guessing, and forgetting that we were also 12 once upon a time. So as a I am very much an evidence-based teacher. I believe in using the published research to inform everything, and that's what we do here on Saturday Breakfast. So that's what we are going to do today. um, and I suppose all that is left is to get down to business. I think before we start talking about this specific study, it's good to take a bit of a step backwards and think about why this sense of belonging seems to be so important. Because if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, good old Maslow, um, it's kind of in the middle. It's the third rung of the five. So you've got your physiological needs at the base. So these are the things that Maslow says you physically cannot live without. So breathing, food, water, shelter, clothing, sleep. If you are not having those needs met, you are not able to function as a person. You're not able to function as a human being. Above that one, so once those are met, you then look to satisfy safety and security. So health, employment, property, family, and social ability. Once those are met, in order to feel fully self-actualized, you meet your love and belonging needs. So friendship, family, intimacy, connection. And that's the rung for me where this concept of belonging kind of falls. So yeah, it's right there in the middle. Maslow didn't conceptualize it as a base need. He didn't put it on the same um, physiological, you cannot be alive without these things, that he did for, breathing and food and water. But he also didn't conceptualize it as being a bit more esoteric, a bit more airy fairy, like the self-actualization right there at the top of the triangle, where you've got like morality, creativity, spontaneity, acceptance. He kind of positions it right slap bang in the middle, where it is of import. You need it in order to feel like your needs are being met, but it's not so important that you cannot physically be alive without it. But interestingly, research by Baumeister and Leary from 1995 argues with that and actually suggests that this need to belong should be, I mean, they didn't say this, they didn't reference Maslow, so this is just kind of me taking their data and applying it to the hierarchy of needs. But they essentially argued that it needs to be lower down, that it probably sits in safety and security, so that second rung, and could be argued to be a physiological need and to sit right at the base of that triangle, to be something that you physically cannot be a functioning human being without. Um, which I found really interesting, sort of as I was reading their piece. It's called The Need to Belong, and they published it in 1995. And they were basically saying that it's a fundamental human motivation, this desire to form and maintain strong, stable interpersonal relationships, um, that should be on that same tier as needs like safety and food. Um, because when that need for connection, when that need for friendship, that need for belonging goes unmet, we see consequences across mental health, physical health, and behavior. And, you know, as much as I may not like saying this, 1995 was 3 decades ago. Um, and even now, all this time later, that paper still acts as a bit of a foundation stone for academic work, at least, into concepts of belonging and the link between belonging and well-being. So I think wherever you personally are going to place it, and I think our own, without doing a lot of psychological, physiological research of our own senses of how important things like belonging are will depend on our own experience. It will be filtered through what we think, how we feel. But I think generally we can be in agreement that even if we don't think that it's down on that first physiological needs rung of Maslow's hierarchy, even if we don't rank it in the same um, of the same importance as food, water, shelter, clothing, then it's going to be in that second or that third rung. I don't think anybody would argue that belonging is a self-actualization need, that it's at the very top, that it's a nice thing to have. And if you are going to be a perfect, well-rounded person, you know, that's what you need to get there. But if you don't have it, it's not the end of the world. Although, of course, if you would argue that, please do let me know in the comments, because I would be interested to know kind of why you think that way, and where that idea comes from. More recently, so in 2021, Allen and her colleagues published in the Australian Journal of Psychology, where they tried to pull together this whole modern field of belonging studies, I suppose, into a single framework. And they basically defined belonging as the subjective feeling of deep connection with social groups, physical places, and individual and collective experiences. And I think that that's really interesting, because up until I read that, I mostly considered belonging to be about with other people. Am I a part of this group? Do I belong with these other people? I hadn't really before thought about place in terms of belonging. And I think that that is a privilege that I have, because, you know, as a physically able-bodied person, I don't have to worry about accessibility into a space. I don't have to look at a set of stairs going up to a museum entrance, for example, and then have to look around for a ramp. And if I can't find one, think, oh, okay, clearly I don't belong here. And so that's why it had never occurred to me before. But physical space, and there's a lot of academic research happening at the moment about physical space, not just in disability studies, but across all sorts of domains. And it is quite interesting when you start thinking about marginalized groups, yes, but all groups, all types of people, what the actual space you are in can say about whether or not they belong. Now, a couple of years ago, I did a show on the aesthetics of the classroom. and we talked about whether or not our classrooms needed to be like Instagram worthy. And this is still a conversation that is going on. And I'm seeing a lot of back to school teacher content at the moment, particularly coming out of the US, which is about teachers setting up their classrooms. And the ones who are prepared to spend a lot of money on classroom decor are kind of setting it up. And interestingly, I feel that they are setting it up as their space that children are welcomed into, as opposed to prioritizing the children who are coming into it. I'm not saying that this is what all teachers who want an Instagram worthy classroom are doing, not by any stretch of the imagination, but that is my interpretation of what I'm seeing. And I think it's an interesting thing to consider. Who does your classroom belong to? Whose classroom is it? Is it your classroom that should reflect your personality? Is it the children's classroom, and so it should reflect their personalities, their interests, in which case you can't really get it set up and personalized until you've met the class, you know what the dynamics are, you know what the interests are. Is it the school's classroom, in which case there needs to be some kind of uniformity, policies about display? And what does the classroom environment say about the people who do and don't belong in it? I'm thinking about one that I saw, who a teacher had a lot of sports memorabilia up on the wall. This teacher very clearly, very sporty. I think a middle school teacher coming out of the US, clearly a very sporty person. So the walls were decorated with jerseys and banners and pennants and all sorts of things that it looks really cool. It's a great looking space, and it clearly reflects that teacher's personality. So it is that teacher's room. But is it welcoming to all students? How will the students who are not particularly sporty feel about being in there? Will they feel welcome? I think there's a lot to think about in terms of space. And when we think about belonging and inclusion and physical spaces that we all belong in, and how when you've got a shared space, you can make it belonging friendly, you can make it welcoming for everybody without it being very generic, without it being very sterile. And as somebody who is not an interior designer and has no sense of decoration, of decor whatsoever, who was relieved when I found out my co-teacher when I was teaching year 6 was an art specialist, because it meant that I could ask her very kindly to take care of all the displays, and I did an extra batch of marking, so that our poor class didn't have to look at my rubbish attempts at display. I know that I can't really comment on these things, but it is something that I think is quite interesting to think about. But going back to Alan's paper, she and her colleagues also noted that sense of belonging predicting outcomes across mental health, physical health, social functioning, economic functioning, and behavior. So we've now got quite a few different studies that are all coming to the same conclusion, that this idea of belonging is important to young people. And I don't kind of want to do a cause and effect correlation here, because I don't know which way around it is. I don't know whether belonging is going to influence your behavior or whether your behavior is going to influence a sense of belonging. That's not mine to say, but we do see this relationship between the two, and it's quite an important relationship. And of course, it takes that concept of belonging outside of friendship groups. And I think quite often when we think about belonging, when we think about whether a child feels connected in school, the friendship group is the first place that we go to, and it's the first thing that we think about. It's the first thing that we look at. And on the surface of it, it's the first thing that the children think about as well. We know, particularly for our early adolescents, for our 12, 13, 14-year-olds, that friendship group is the whole world to them. And so um, it's very natural for us to kind of boil down everything about belonging to the friendship group. But as Alan and her colleagues demonstrated, there is a lot more to it than that. There's a complementary theoretical stand then, which is self-determination theory, which is good old Richard Ryan and Edward Deci. Now, we've talked about self-determination theory on the show before, and it's that idea that who you perceive yourself to be ultimately becomes who you are. And it's kind of on the surface of it, it's to do with, or it's related to, growth mindset. I know that growth mindset has been debunked. It's one of those theories that I was very annoyed when it was being touted in British schools, because it had already been debunked by that point. Dweck had already written about how she didn't believe in it anymore, and yet we had the growth mindset man come and do an inset. Not that I'm bitter about that at all. But it is related to that. It's that kind of cyclical X leads to Y, which leads back round to X type thing. And so Ryan and Deci kind of argued that humans have three basic psychological needs that must be met in order for us to have actual well-being and motivation, which will then lead us to flourish. And they said that those three needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And by relatedness, they mean the feeling of being connected to and cared for by other people. And what's quite interesting about relatedness is that it underpins motivation. So they suggest that a student who isn't feeling connected to their teacher, their peers, isn't just having a bad time of it, but that they are missing out one of the core foundations of intrinsic motivation, which means that they themselves then just don't have any oomph, they don't have any impetus to go and do the work that we are asking them to do. And all of this is very interesting, and we've kind of overextended it. We've applied it basically to all human beings. Maslow applies to everybody. Baumeister and Leary, their need to belong can apply to everybody. But what's really striking is that it's so important in early adolescence and adolescence in general, much more than in other life stages. And there are a few kind of converging reasons for this, which is where the Trolley and Alcon paper and their literature review within that paper comes in handy. Because they describe identity construction in early adolescence as being grounded in that process of socialization. So the idea that they put forward, based on all of the literature that they had read, is that the ties that a young person forges with the people and the activities and their environment in early adolescence has an impact on their identity formation and the person that they are going to be, the person that they are going to consider themselves to be later on in life. And it's described as an actually active process. It's not kind of bumbling along, drifting from friendship group to friendship group and kind of chameleoning your way through, adopting the guise of whatever group you have positioned yourself with this week. But they've demonstrated that young people are actually making choices when it comes to the people that they are hanging out with, the places that they go, the places that they feel they most belong. And they actually do a cost benefit analysis. Even though they're not putting it in those terms, they're not necessarily aware that that's what they're doing. This is absolutely what they're doing. And they are showing a marked preference for their closest friends. And they are demonstrating that their closest friends' opinions matter more to them than anybody else. And again, this is one of those things where you might go, well, yes, Darren, that's common sense. Anybody who has spoken to a teenager at least once in their life will know that they care more about what their friends think than what their parents think. But it is a little bit more nuanced than that, I feel. They do care about what their friends think, but not all friends are given equal weight. The closer the friendship, the more weight is given to the opinion. And this is why that concept of best friends is so important. It's something that we see beginning in early childhood that then kind of intensifies as we go into adolescence. And it's why falling out with the best friend can seem like such a life or death experience to young people, because it kind of is. You are losing the person whose opinion, whose thoughts, whose feelings you value the most. And kind of the reason for that is that concept of sameness. Children realize that they're not adults. They know that they are not the generation of their parents. They know that they're not on the same level. They know that they are not on the same level as their teachers. And so they look for the people who are similar to them. They look for the people who are on their level. They look for the people who they know or they believe at that point will be part of their future, part of their lives, part of what they will take with them when they gain independence. And that quite plausibly will be their friends. You know, when somebody moves out for the first time, yes, they might still chat to their parents every single day if they have got a good relationship with them. But they are also very likely to try to spend time with their closest friends every single day. And this is even, you know, when we've gone beyond this psychological need for belonging, for sameness, for sticking with your own social group and just interacting with the world. So from very early on in adolescence, our young people are demonstrating social strategy. They understand that their relationships with other people can help them to get ahead, can help them to learn new things, can help them to feel safe. And they are making decisions, they are weighing up the pros and cons about whether the individual people that they are around are going to help them to feel that way, help them to flourish, help them to be safe, or whether they are going to be a threat to them. And the people that they judge as being helpful, as being safe, are going to be the ones that they are close friends with. And the ones who they feel are going to be a threat to them are the ones that they distance.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support. and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Now, what's really interesting about this, when we look at it from an organizational perspective, from a school perspective, is the role that school plays. Lerner, Phelps, Foreman, and Bowers talk about how early adolescence is this period, sort of as we defined it before the adverts there, as requiring these positive social contacts, needing that feeling of social integration, having an attachment to pro-social organizations. So this is why so many kids like to join clubs, football teams, hockey teams. Maybe they'll start a band, something that will be a social outlet for them in a positive way and that is designed to be positive for them. And their ability to find their way through various social contexts in order for positive physiological and psychological developments to occur. So in early adolescence, we need these positive senses of belonging in order to mature into physiologically, psychologically settled adults. And as somebody who was bullied as a child, I found that really interesting because I started to think about my own experiences as an early adolescent, sort of through my teenage years, and how that sense of belonging or not, and that sense of, the people that I was accepted by and the people that I was rejected by, how that has influenced how I define myself, even now as a fully grown 41-year-old man. And sort of like a lot of my perception of how I think of myself, of how I think of what I can and what I can't do, how I perceive my own positive and negative traits, a lot of that is to do with how I was treated when I was at school. And to me, that was a bit of a shock to realize, because I honestly wouldn't have said that my bullying affected me. I was one of those kids that didn't really care what other people thought. And generally, as an adult, in fact, I've literally just before the show started, I posted this on LinkedIn. I tend to be a bit of a live and let live type of person. I believe in some things, I don't believe in others, but generally, as long as we're not harming each other, I don't see what the problem with most things are. So to kind of reflect, to sit with this week and reflect on it and think about particularly some of the, without wishing to be flippant with this word, but more traumatic experiences that I had as a teenager, especially, the things that really have stuck with me, the things that I will still ruminate on occasionally. It has really kind of shown me that everybody is impacted by this. I think it's really important for us to recognize that. And even for us now as adults to kind of spend some time perhaps reflecting on it, thinking about it, figuring out, especially if you were or you felt you were badly bullied at school, whether or not there are parts of you that are still clinging to that still define yourself by how those other 14 and 15-year-olds defined you back in 1972 or whenever it might have been. And think about whether it's still true, or whether you still should be defined by how those other teenagers felt about you back in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, whenever it might have been. Um, but that kind of then shines a light on something that Trollet and Arcan talk about in their paper, which is that the school itself, in this kind of model of early adolescent identity development, isn't a place first and foremost for learning. And as much as I hate saying that, because I think it should be, um, this is clearly something that that governments know, because they like to keep piling stuff onto us that isn't about learning. But also for our young people, it's not about learning. It's a place that learning happens to occur, where academic, scholarly learning happens to occur. But it's the place that their social learning, and whether they do or don't find their place in the world, is most likely to happen. And I am going to kind of caveat all that by saying that actually, I think that I disagree slightly with Tolle and Arcan's conclusion, because I actually think that academic scholarly learning does have a lot to do with identity construction. I think the subjects that you perceive yourself as being good at, the subjects that you perceive yourself as being bad at, can actually help to create that sense of belonging, because they can give you a group of people, the other people who are good at languages, in my case, who are good at drama, who are good at creative writing, who are good at football. Not all of those are, are about me. Let me just be very clear with that. But yeah, you can help. You can find your tribe in academics, in the people that you are around who are also self-perceived as being good at those same things. And let's be very honest, for us as teachers, school isn't just a place that we go to collect our paychecks every month. It's also a place where we do or don't belong. And there is growing research that looks at collegiality, which is something that we did a show about a few weeks ago. So go back and find that one if you are interested in this. And how that sense of being among colleagues, that sense of being accepted by the people in your department, your year group level, your staff room, wherever it may be, how important that is in an adult sense of well-being. So nothing that we're going to talk about over the next 30 minutes or so is just related to children, because wherever we're placing it on Maslow's hierarchy, it's there. And even at the very highest, so even if we are sort of downplaying the importance of belonging as much as possible, it's still slap bang in the middle. So it is still a foundational, important physiological, psychological need that we have. All right, so let's go back to Drolle and Alcon's research, because like I said, one of the reasons that I love this paper is that it grounds the children's voices, and it actually lets us know what they are thinking, albeit, yes, there are some important things for us to know about these children. So the research took place in Eastern Ontario, and it focused specifically on their Francophone community. So specifically, these are the children who are growing up in French-speaking houses, living perhaps in French-speaking towns, French-speaking villages, perhaps going to a French-speaking school, but in a predominantly English-speaking place. So already we've got for these children a sense of othering, because the language that they are growing up speaking is not the same one as the language that is all around them. Now, obviously, as a linguist, I'm going to say that's a great thing because they are already operating fluently in two languages across a broad range of contexts. But I also know as a linguist how language can help to shape identity. And if you are a minority language user, even if that minority language is still a majority language, because let's be honest, French is massive, um, it still does shape how you feel about who you are, your sense of place, your sense of belonging. I, in fact, encountered this just this week. Um, I speak English as my first language, so I'm not a minority language person. I live in England, so majority language is all around me. But when I was on the bus to go to where I was going on Tuesday, I noticed that one of the signs was written bilingually in English and Cornish. And as somebody who is learning Cornish so that I can teach it, I found that weirdly inclusive because I don't see, I don't live anywhere near Cornwall. I'm in Gloucester, so, it takes me about 4 hours on the train to get there. Um, but seeing a sign bilingually in my mother tongue and then another language which I speak kind of made me feel seen in a way that I personally don't experience very often. Again, as a native English speaking person living in England. So, our linguistic heritage, the number of languages that we speak, the languages that we choose to speak, the way that we use linguistic context, those are all really important for our sense of identity and our sense of belonging. And that is important for us to remember about these kids. So in 2007, Drolet and Arcan conducted 20 interviews with school staff and youth workers. Then in 2009, they went back and they conducted 12 interviews with the young people themselves, 6 boys and 6 girls, all aged 12 to 13 in 7th grade in the Canadian system, and all coming out of the same school. So, this is a tiny study. It's a small sample. It's not even a class in a school in a province in a country. But that doesn't mean that these results are not valid, especially when this type of research doesn't happen very often. And when, we don't get the young people's voices coming out and talking about their experiences. And what keeps coming out of the data, what kept coming up in these conversations with the young people themselves was the concept of their peer group. They weren't bothered about popularity. They weren't bothered about status. So all of those things that we see in the media as being presented as things that young people care about, all these things that we think they care about because we assume that they are worried about their follower count and how many likes they got on their latest Instagram post and all of that malarkey, none of that is actually important, at least to the children who were interviewed for this study. They just want a simple, reliable friendship group. One of the participants, adolescent 8, as they are anonymized, put it like this. They said, when a bunch of my friends are out sick at the same time, it gets me down. And I'm like, who am I going to have lunch with now? And I really like that quote because as a teacher, I'm going to be very honest right now. As a teacher, when I've had a child come and say this to me before, oh, Mr. Lester, so and so, my best friend is away, and I'm not sure who I'm going to sit with at lunch. My gut reaction has been to say, well, there are 30 of us in the class. Lots of other people like you, get on with you, go and have lunch with one of them. Kind of dismissing it, downplaying it. And so I find it really interesting that, at least for adolescent 8, this idea of who am I going to have lunch with when when most of my friends are off sick at the same time, is a very legitimate, very real concern. And it prompted a bit of a flashback for me, being in, younger than this person, because I was in junior school. I think I was in like year 3 or year 4. So I would have been 7, 8, maybe 9 at the earliest. And I remember, I think it was the flu. It was something was going around. And so a whole bunch of my friends were off sick at the same time. And I had that exact same concern. I personally wasn't too bothered about what was going to happen when I was in the classroom, because I knew that I was in my seat, on my table. And yes, my friends generally were also there. But even if I was the only one on my table, that didn't matter so much, because I was there to do my lessons anyway. But it was, who am I going to sit with at lunch? Who am I going to play with at playtime? What am I going to do when I'm on my own in that unstructured time? That was my big concern. And yeah, like I said, I think this is something that is very important, because it's counterintuitive to that, or to those pop psychology narratives that we have about teenage cruelty, about status seeking. Because these researchers are explicitly noting that the young teens interviewed in their study didn't frame their friendships in that way. They didn't frame them in terms of popularity and getting a good reputation. But what they were wanting was to be associated with people who were similar to themselves, and who would accept them, and to live just very straightforwardly in a sense of belonging. They weren't actually after performativity. They didn't want to have to play a role in order to belong. They didn't actually want to have to follow an aesthetic that wasn't necessarily theirs. They didn't actually want to have to learn a whole new vocabulary, learn a whole new sport. They just wanted people that they could be their authentic, easy, unguarded, unfiltered selves around. And again, that seems a little bit contrary to what we were talking about last week, when we were looking at the brat aesthetic, and we thought about how there were certain ways that you would dress, that curated sloppiness to it, the carefully constructed unkempt look, because any aesthetic is curated. But what has occurred to me since then, and I'm always happy to kind of go back and say, I did think one thing, but now that I've learned a little bit more, I think something else, is that maybe the people who are drawn to the brat aesthetic, or to the goth aesthetic, or the emos, or other subgroup may still exist. Perhaps that's not a performance as we might consider it. It's not that they are being untruthful to who they actually are, but that is something that they like. That is the way that they are choosing to dress. They are not getting rid of all of their brightly colored clothes and only wearing black because that's what their friends are doing. It's what they want to do, and they have found other friends who want to do that too. And it kind of flips a lot of what we think about in terms of young person socialization on its head. Because quite often we talk about herd mentality as in peer pressure, as in somebody wants to do something and encourages the others to do it. But what if it's a bit more straightforward than that? And what if our young people are seeking safety in literal herd behavior by attempting to find other people who are as much like them as possible. The second major theme that came out of these interviews was their relationship with non-family adults. So kind of in scholastic terms, their teachers, their principals, their youth workers. And what was really interesting about this, if you do a semantic analysis of it, so if you look specifically at the language that these kids were using, it was very informal, incredibly casual, not a way that you would expect them to talk about a teacher, definitely not to talk to the teacher. They described the teachers they felt connected to as fun, funny, chill, and cool. And as we know, there is something psychologically important about the language that you use when you speak to and about people, because language can create or lower a barrier. If you want to not get close to somebody, if you want to put up a wall, if you want to demonstrate superiority, then you are going to choose very specific language patterns. You are probably not going to use too many contractions. You are not going to use too many verbal fillers, ums, ers. You're going to think very carefully about what you say before you say it. You are probably going to use field-specific lexis. You are going to use big words. You're going to use terminology to demonstrate your intelligence. That creates a wall. If you want to bring somebody in, if you want to create a connection, you're going to be much more casual with them. You might see this in the workplace. You might find that you are more comfortable swearing around certain other adults than others because you have a friendlier, more casual, more familiar relationship with them. I'm not saying whether swearing should be language that we use in school. Obviously, never around kids. Whether or not you swear around other adults is entirely up to you and is down to your own linguistic repertoire. I'm not saying that it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that it's something that might happen. Adolescent 8, I like Adolescent 8. They were very vocal. Described a teacher by saying, he understands how we feel. He can tell when I need something. And Adolescent 10 said, I like my teachers a lot because they listen to us when we want to talk about stuff. And again, in those cases, it's not the teacher's subject knowledge that is being appreciated. It's not their classroom management, even though we like to tell stories of kids preferring teachers who are strict because then they can learn. Classroom management, at least in this this study, hasn't come up as a theme at all. It's about the teacher's ability to accurately read the student. He can tell when I need something. It's about our ability to intervene. Because if we can tell when a student is struggling and we can intervene before they ask, that makes the student feel seen. It makes them feel like we are paying specific attention to them and we know what they need before they even know what they need. They don't need to know that the reason we can do that is because we're now on our 20th class teaching this exact same content and we've seen all of the struggles before. Because that isn't important. What is important is that perceived being seen, the perception of being perceived, if you like. The idea that we are looking at them, we are aware, we care enough to intervene before they even ask. Now, it's a high bar, if we're very honest, isn't it? Because if you have got a class of 30, maybe if you're a primary teacher, you've got a class of 34, 35. Maybe if you're teaching in Hong Kong or in mainland China even, you might have a class of 40, 50 students. So being able to see all of them all of the time is really difficult. It is really difficult. And it's not something that we ever measure ourselves against. When we're told to circulate, it's to make sure that everyone is on task, to make sure that they know what they're doing. When we talk about our pastoral care policies, when we talk about our safeguarding, we might say, oh, yeah, we have good relationships with our kids. We build good relationships with our young people, but we never define what that means. Nobody has ever actually, now that I think about it, in all of these insets that I've sat through about restorative conversations and building relationships, and if you have a great relationship, there will never, ever be any behavioral issues. Nobody has ever told me what a great relationship looks like. It's one of those buzzwords that just seems to be thrown around. And I now think it's this. I think a great relationship with a child is about them feeling like they are being seen. Because if they are being seen by you, the adult, they feel like they belong in your classroom. Regardless of whether your walls are covered in sports memorabilia or video game decals or books, or whether it's just plain sterile white. And honestly, I don't like myself for saying this, but it doesn't even matter if that feeling is genuine. It doesn't matter if you've actually seen that they are struggling and so you've intervened, or whether you just happened to be in the right place at the right time. What is important is that the student feels seen. Their own sense of self is feeling validated. I feel like I'm important in this room. I feel like I belong because my teacher recognizes that I need help before I've even said anything. And then all is right in the world. If we flip to the adult side of the interviews, we get some really interesting language out of the professionals as well. School staff and youth workers across the board emphasize this value of being present and being receptive. They believe very much in being highly attuned to these day in, day out realities of our young people, of their young people. One staff member said, you work with teens, you have to have a relationship with them. Again, didn't actually explain what they meant by that, because it's easier, let's be honest, it's easier if we don't explain what we mean by have a relationship, because if we do define that, we could find out that it doesn't work. And actually, build a relationship is quite a nice catch-all, very easy soundbite to solve any problem, so long as we don't worry about what having a relationship is. So hopefully, the big thing that I have taken from this, and the thing that I'm sort of encouraging you all to take from this, if nothing else, is that this idea of building a relationship, having a relationship, is just about making our young people feel seen, feel heard, feel valid in your classroom. Several of these adults, though, described a blurry line between something that looks like friendship and looks like a positive, supportive relationship that is warm, but also recognizes your authority as the teacher, as the adult. One of the teachers said, these children are not our friends, but even so, I can't just be a machine that spews out knowledge. I have students who still come back to see me even after a few years because somehow we mattered to those students. And that is a really odd tension that we live in as teachers, that we have to sit with as teachers, because we are not their friends. We do not want to be their friends. because, well, I know I can only speak for myself, but I am 41. I have very little in common with people who are 12, 13, 14, 15. And it's like, I remember once being in an assembly. It was an end of year assembly, or it might have been an end of term. Might have been going back for Christmas. But we sat in the assembly, and the head teacher stood up on stage, and he always liked to end his assemblies by telling our young people to be kind to their parents. That he recognized they were tired, but not to take it out on their families. And one thing that he said to them, which I think was really brave to say, was, we, your teachers, like you a lot. We have a lot of respect for you, but we don't love you. Your family does. And I really appreciated that. I really appreciated that he said that, because it helped to reinforce that line. It helped to remind the children that, yes, we are here for you. Yes, we see you. Yes, we support you. But at the end of the day, we are your teachers, first, foremost, before anything else. And there are other people, hopefully, who will fulfill that role as loving adults. We can like you, and it's good if we like you, but we don't love you. And I think that's a very important distinction to keep in mind, especially when we are thinking about building relationships, and especially when we are thinking about making sure that children feel included. Because again, as important as it is for the child's perception to be, I feel seen, Mr. Lester noticed that I was struggling and he came over to help me, it's also important that they don't perceive us as being more involved than we actually are. Perception is interesting. Perception is very much linked to identity, and it's something that we only control about ourselves. We don't control about other people. So generally, we've got this idea of the adults being people who see them, who recognize them, who validate them, and their peers, the other children in the group, as being people who are like them. And I think that difference is really, really important. I think it's good for them to have people who are like them, their friendship groups, their even the people who aren't their friends, but seeing that they are going through the same developmental stages as them, that they are in the same kind of having very similar life experiences, seeing things for the first time, having people to talk about those things with. And then also seeing that people who are older than them, people who have been through the things that they have been through, still care for them just in a different way. And having both of those and realizing that you can be cared for by a range of different types of people, that you can belong based on a range of different types of people, I think is really, really important. And this then brings us on to conversations about role modeling, because this also comes up in the paper. So drawing on the work of Vescio, Wild and Crosswhite, Drolet and Arcand start to think about the difference between a mentor and a role model. And they define a mentor as somebody who maintains an actual personal relationship with the young person. So someone who is older than them, who can act as a confidant, as a guide, as a counselor, and who can actually actively provide support when the young person is going through something, versus a role model who is somebody that the adolescent wants to imitate or match in terms of their status, but may or may not be someone who has a direct relationship with them at all. And what's really interesting to me is that the research suggests that the role models who are imperfect or who have visible limits, and this is what Drolet and Alcan call being more human, tend to have greater influence over our young people because they appear more reachable. Now, as teachers, if we are using these definitions, we shouldn't be mentors to our young people because that oversteps a professional boundary, at least in an English context where I'm teaching, that would overstep a professional boundary. But we can be role models. And this actually ties into an interesting conversation that I think it was the Points of View team had the other day about whether or not teachers are entitled to a personal life. So if you haven't listened to that conversation, please do, because it's a really quite a scary thing they were talking about. But in brief, it's this story of a teacher who was out on a night out, had a little bit too much to drink because he was out on a night out with his mates, and he was encountered by some of his students who filmed him. And there's then debate about sort of what happens during the filming and whether everybody behaved appropriately, and there's discussion about whether the filming actually shows the whole truth of the matter. It's a whole thing. But what I want to think about is that the conversation that has come up around that has been about whether or not teachers are entitled to a private life, whether or not we are entitled to a night out with our friends, whether or not we are entitled to be normal human beings, because as something that was discussed on another Points of View show recently, quite often teachers, because everybody has had a teacher, teachers are kind of othered by people. We are not seen as being actual people. We are a species of our own. We are teachers. And people don't like this idea that teachers are also teachers. But because we are role models instead of mentors, we are generally expected to behave flawlessly, to be pillars of the community, to use that old-fashioned term, to be paragons of virtue, to not get sloppy drunk on a night out with your friends, just in case one of your students happens to see you, to live our whole lives as role models, just in case one of our students happens to walk past. But that then implies that this concept of a role model is somebody who is flawless. And we talk about how dangerous that is in terms of social media. We always tell our young people about how Instagram feeds are carefully curated. You're not seeing somebody's real life, you're seeing the highlight reel. And yet, when we talk about real life role models, whether it be teachers or whether it's footballers or actors or whoever it is, we still expect that virtue from them. We still expect that flawlessness from them. That word role model has connotations of perfection, because if somebody isn't perfect, what's the point of looking up to them? And so I think it's really interesting, and I love the fact that Drolet and Alcan came to this and they redefined this concept of a role model, and they have suggested that actually a role model who isn't perfect, who is more human, because of those imperfections, is actually more entitled of that that term role model, because there's nothing wrong with our young people learning from our mistakes. But the problem is, if we're going to be role models as teachers, which we are supposed to be, especially if we've got this kind of mentor role model dichotomy set up, where we're not going to be their mentors because that's a bit more personal, a bit too personal, then yes, to answer the question, we are entitled to a private life, and we are entitled to make mistakes in that private life because we are more human for it. And it's that humanity that actually makes us better role models.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about why this sense of belonging is important, and we've talked about how we as teachers can kind of foster that sense of belonging in acting as role models, not necessarily as mentors. But let's also think about what practical activities we can implement in September or whenever it is we are going to go back to school to make sure that our children feel this sense of belonging. Because this also came out in the discussion. The children were very clear about what sorts of things they felt would help them to feel like they belonged in a school, that they belonged in a classroom. The first and the most important was structured activities. The teens and the adults both repeatedly pointed out that extracurricular activities and other structured non-academic activities were central to building friendship and to building feelings of belonging because they let the young people see each other in a different light. It helped them to bring out the best in each other, and it helped them to share genuine enjoyment together. And I don't think that this needs to be relegated, for want of a better word, to extracurriculars. As somebody who is very interested in and very much enjoys gamified learning and pedagogies of play, I think that this can happen in a classroom. It can happen in a lesson with an academic, scholarly objective. You just have to make sure that you've planned it well enough. Sadly, I don't like the overemphasis on extracurriculars that happens in school. Did we see earlier in the week when we were talking about schools being given attendance targets that apparently we've got to make sure that there are after school clubs running on Fridays to make kids more inclined to go to school later in the week? I don't think that children should be going to school purely for extracurriculars. And I also don't believe that school should be the only place that they can go for extracurriculars. There needs to be more funding for our young people at a town, county, district, parish, whatever level. But that's a whole separate rant that I have quite often. But these shared structured activities give young people something to do together that isn't just standing around and performing sociability, that isn't exhausting, and that builds a lot of rapport. And I think, again, if we look at the differences between male and female socialization, there is that old phrase about women build rapport face to face and men build rapport side by side. And there's this idea that for our boys, especially, providing something that they can do together, providing an activity, is going to be better for their socialization and their sense of belonging than running a club where they can sit and just chat, just having a common room. Secondly, we've got those behaviors that make an adult feel trustworthy and legitimate, that make the young person feel like they belong in a room where an adult is in charge. Being present, being receptive, and being sensitive to what our young people are dealing with day to day are the things that Trolle and Archon's interviewees came up with as being the most important things. It's also important for us to remember that young people don't like to feel like they are inferior. Particularly in early adolescence, they recognize that they are becoming adults and they want to be treated that way. So children are going to feel like they belong if they are not feeling infantilized, if they're not feeling belittled, if they're not feeling talked down to. One school staff member in the interview recalled a student who challenged authority directly and said, "Teacher so-and-so hassles me, so I hassle her." And in early adolescence, they very much reject any kind of framing that we attempt to impose in terms of status or authority. I'm talking again specifically in kind of westernized Anglophone, here Francophone contexts. We don't have status just because we're a teacher. That concept is rejected by our adolescents. And so it's almost like we need to earn the respect. I will respect you if you respect me. Thirdly, the researchers explicitly frame school belonging through that lens of self-determination theory. And they note that within a scholastic context, students have a pervasive drive and an innate psychological need to form those significant relationships with their teachers, but also with their peers, and to build ties to the school as an institution in its own right. So we need to make sure that we are giving our children time to talk to each other. For our schools that insist on silent corridors, silent transition, we need to make sure that there is enough time at break time, at lunchtime, where they can actually sit and socialize. Because it doesn't matter if you're all wearing a uniform. It doesn't matter if you stand up and sing the school song or recite the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever it might be. The school branding is less important in that feeling of connection to place than actually building a relationship with it. And how do you build a relationship with something? By talking, by conversing, by creating that relationship. So that's on the practical level what we can do. And that's why this sense of belonging is so important, and we should never belittle it. I know that it's very easy, particularly if you're dealing with like your fifth friendship issue, friendship group issue of the day, to say, oh, don't worry about it, go and find somebody else to play with. But that's not the point. It's not about having somebody to play with. It's about having those people who you feel closely connected to. And I think that's something that can be very easy for us to forget. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed today's show, that you found it, as always, as interesting as I did. I think there's a lot that we can talk about when it comes to belonging, when it comes to who should play what role in creating these senses of belonging. But I do think that one of the things that we need to tackle, if we're going to tackle things like school avoidance, like anti-academic sentiment, is accepting that children feel they need to belong somewhere and figuring out what we can do to facilitate that. I will be back with you next week, next Saturday morning from 9 a.m. UK time. We will be talking about gamified reading. Going back to, like I said earlier, one of my main loves, which is the gamification of education. We're going to be talking about how we can gamify reading, and I've done some really interesting research, some reading into whether or not gamification actually has an impact when it comes to improving reading outcomes. So I do hope that you will join me for that one. I hope that you all have a fantastic week, whatever you are doing in this next week of the holiday, or if you are getting ready to go back to school already, good luck with that. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of the weekend, a fantastic week, and I will see you next Saturday morning. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.